The rain fell hard that day, drumming on the fresh mound of earth where a young widow wept for her husband. His life had been stolen by outlaws, leaving her alone in the unforgiving Wild West, with nothing but grief and an empty wagon. And then, as the mourners scattered and the priest prepared to leave, a figure stepped forward, a widowed rancher, carrying his own burden of loss. But what he offered wasn't comfort. It was a proposal. Right there, at her husband's grave, he asked her to marry him. What happened next would not only change her destiny, but his life forever. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you love Wild West stories. The wagon rattled along the endless stretch of prairie, its wooden wheels creaking like an old hymn as Marty Whitmore and her husband, Aaron Whitmore, pressed forward into the unknown, two horses pulling not just their earthly belongings but the weight of their dreams. And though the land was barren, empty, and unforgiving, they saw it as a canvas untouched, a soil waiting to bear witness to the life they longed to create. Aaron, his eyes alive with fire, spoke often of the ranch they would build, of the fences that would mark their claim, of the cattle that would graze under their care, and Marty, her face glowing with equal excitement, imagined the laughter of children filling the air, the scent of bread baking in the small home they would someday raise from timber and sweat, and every evening as they camped beneath the canvas of their wagon, the stars blazing like diamonds above, they whispered plans for the future, trading fears for hope, sorrows for songs of tomorrow, their faith in each other stronger than any storm that might come. At dawn, the prairie seemed to stretch endlessly, the rising sun painting the sky in fire and gold, and they rose with it, their hands rough with work but their spirits unbroken, building in their minds what their hands had yet to carve. And though wolves howled in the distance and the winds carried the loneliness of the frontier, they did not falter, for love bound them closer than iron, and the dream of freedom, of a life unshackled by the crowded towns and rules of old places, was enough to guide them onward. And so they pressed deeper into the wilderness, hearts trembling with both fear and excitement, until the day came when the wheels of the wagon stopped on their land, a stretch of earth that to others might look wild and worthless, but to them was holy ground, the beginning of everything. And as Aaron stepped down and pressed his boots into the soil, he declared it theirs, his voice trembling with pride, and Marty, standing beside him with her hand pressed over her belly as if she could already feel the future stirring within her, nodded with tears in her eyes, knowing this would be the place where they would grow old, where they would raise sons and daughters, where they would build not just a home but a legacy carved from struggle and faith. Their wagon became their shelter, its canvas walls flapping in the wind. And by night the crackle of firelight warmed their faces as they shared bread and whispered of barns, of cattle, of the orchard she dreamed of planting in the spring, and by day he walked the boundaries, already imagining the fence lines, while she tended the horses, her hands steady and sure. And though the land was vast and empty, it rang with the music of their voices, and every sunrise felt like the turning of a page, every breath like the first lines of a story that would endure beyond them. The morning air was sharp and clean, carrying with it the scent of frost and dry earth as Aaron saddled his horse with practiced hands, the leather creaking under his grip while his wife stood at the wagon's edge, her shawl pulled tight against the chill, watching him with the mixture of pride and worry that only love can bring. And when he mounted and turned back to her, the rising sun struck his face, setting it aglow with the confidence of a man certain of the life they were building, his smile both promise and reassurance as he called out that he would return by noon, perhaps with tales of deer in the thickets or fresh water hidden in some quiet hollow, and she clutched that smile like a talisman, her heart swelling at the sight of him riding strong and steady into the distance, his figure shrinking against the vast sweep of prairie until only the rhythm of hooves lingered in the air. She busied herself through the morning, tending to small chores around the wagon, stirring the fire back to life, brushing the horses, humming little tunes that floated out into the open land, and every now and then she would pause to glance toward the far hills, expecting any moment to see his hat cresting the ridge. But as the sun climbed higher, shadows stretching thin and long, the light began to feel harsher, the silence heavier, and the cheerful notes of her humming faltered until they died entirely, leaving only the wind sighing through the grass, and that wind carried with it not the laughter she had imagined but an unease that grew steadily inside her chest, pressing harder with each passing minute. She set out a plate of bread he had asked for, waiting, then pulled it back when the bread hardened, scolding herself for her worry, telling herself men lose track of time in wide lands, that perhaps he had found something worth lingering over, perhaps a stream, a trail, a patch of fertile soil. Yet the thought brought her no comfort, for in her heart she sensed a wrongness she could not name, a hollow echo inside her that whispered he was too long gone, And so she stood on the edge of their claim, staring into the distance until her eyes blurred, her hands clutching the folds of her skirt as though holding herself together, and the prairie, once so full of promise, now stretched like a vast and indifferent sea, the horizon swallowing her husband's silhouette and giving nothing back, leaving her with nothing but the gnawing silence and the terrible ache of waiting, waiting as the sun blazed toward its zenith and noon came without him, the warmth that had filled her chest that morning fading into a chill that even the fire could not drive away, a dread growing inside her that this land, which they had called sacred, might already be claiming its price. The afternoon sun hung heavy and unforgiving when the sound of hoofs finally broke the long silence, faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, and the young wife rushed to the edge of their camp, her heart leaping with desperate hope that Aaron had returned at last. But what she saw froze her where she stood, for it was not her husband's sure and steady posture on horseback but the bent figure of their neighbor, leading his own mount at a slow and sorrowful pace, and draped lifeless across the saddle was a body, arms hanging limp, boots dragging in the dust, the brim of a familiar hat hiding the face she loved, and in that instant her breath caught in her throat as though the earth itself had closed around her lungs, her knees buckling beneath the weight of what her eyes already knew but her heart refused to accept. She stumbled forward, whispering his name, each step slower than the last until she fell to her knees beside the horse, reaching trembling hands toward him, the smell of blood and dust clinging to his clothes, the finality of death searing her more cruelly than the blazing sun above, and her cries pierced the stillness, raw and broken, as she pressed her cheek to his cold hand, pleading silently with God, with fate, with anyone who might turn back the clock and spare her from this moment. The neighbor, his face weathered by years and sorrow of his own, spoke in a voice that trembled with both pity and urgency, telling her he had found the body on the trail, robbed, beaten, and left for dead by faceless outlaws who had vanished like smoke into the hills, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. And though she wanted to scream, to beg for vengeance, to demand his words be lies, his next words cut deeper than any blade, for he told her the priest who had accompanied him would soon be gone, bound back to town by afternoon, and if the burial was not done before he left, her husband's body would be forced to wait until spring thaw for a service, left to rot in the cold ground without blessing or farewell. The thought struck her like a cruel second death, that the man who had carried her dreams into the wilderness might be denied even a proper burial, and through tears she nodded, though the motion felt like betrayal, as if consenting to the final act of letting him go, her heart clinging desperately to the sound of his laughter, the warmth of his hand, the promises whispered under starlight, yet knowing none of it could call him back. The neighbor reached out to steady her, his hand heavy on her shoulder, and though she recoiled at first, she forced herself to listen, for his words carried not cruelty but necessity, the harsh truth of frontier life that spared no soul its price, and as he led the horse onward toward the shallow ground that would serve as a grave, she followed in silence, every step a tearing away of the life she had dreamed, each breath a reminder that she walked beside death, her own voice gone. Marty's voice barely rose above a whisper when she gave her consent, the words trembling from her lips as though each syllable carried the weight of her very soul, and with that single breath the grim work began. The neighbor and a handful of men cutting rough boards, hammering nails with solemn faces, their hands moving quickly yet reverently to shape a coffin unworthy of the man it would hold, while she sat nearby, her fingers clutching the fabric of her dress until her knuckles whitened, her eyes fixed on the body that had once carried her dreams into this wild land, and when the box was ready they lifted him gently inside, covering him with the same care she had given when she tucked him into their wagon bed at night, though now there was no stirring breath, no warmth to meet her touch, only the stillness of death pressing against her heart like iron. The priest, grave and silent, murmured blessings as they carried the coffin to a shallow grave dug in the rocky soil not far from where their wagon still stood, and though only a few souls gathered, the neighbor, the priest, two men who had come by chance, the air was thick with sorrow, as if the very land bowed in mourning, the sky overhead dimming into shades of gray that threatened rain, and when the coffin was lowered on ropes and the dull thud of wood against earth reached her ears, she let out a cry so raw it seemed to tear the heavens apart, clutching her chest as though her heart itself would split, for with each shovelful of dirt that struck the lid, a piece of her life, her love, her hope was buried too. Her tears fell fast, blurring her vision until she could barely see the mound rising slowly, and she thought of the mornings they had spent whispering of fences and orchards, of the laughter they promised their children would one day echo across this soil, and it struck her cruelly that all of it ended here, in a grave barely deep enough to hold a dream. But still the men continued their work, their movements steady, their faces grim, until the last shovelful fell and the earth swallowed him whole, sealing her future with the finality of stone. And then, as if to echo her grief, the heavens split with a crack of thunder, a jagged streak of lightning cutting the horizon, and the sky broke open, rain lashing down in sheets that drenched the mourners, who quickly scattered for shelter, leaving her alone in the storm, her dress clinging to her skin, her hair plastered across her face. Yet Marty refused to move, kneeling in the mud, her hands pressing into the fresh mound of earth as though by sheer force she could hold him near, her sobs mingling with the downpour until it seemed the world itself wept with her, the storm raging like the hollow within her chest. And though every instinct urged her to flee, to seek warmth, Marty remained, bound to the grave not by duty but by love, broken yet unyielding, the rain baptizing her loss. Through the storm, the world narrowed to mud and wind, a blur of rain and thunder that drove the air into her lungs like steel, yet beyond it came a figure, slow, steady, and resolute, breaking the veil of haze. Clark Caldwell emerged from the gray, boots sinking in the churned earth, coat heavy with rain, hat pressed low over a weathered face that spoke of years under sun and sorrow. The priest, standing nearby, watched quietly, his umbrella useless against the wind, knowing the urgency in this moment. She was still kneeling beside the fresh mound of her husband's grave, her hands clenching into the wet earth, her body trembling not from cold alone but from grief that felt like it would swallow her whole. Winter was coming fast, the air already tasting of frost, and she knew her wagon offered no lasting shelter, just a temporary refuge that shivered under the storm's wrath. Hunger and cold pressed on her like the weight of the earth, and the thought of nights spent under canvas with nothing but wood and rain for warmth tightened the knot in her chest. His approach was silent save for the heavy crunch of boots, and when he reached her side, Clark knelt without ceremony, shoulders bowed as if carrying the weight of both worlds. His eyes met hers, steady but unreadable, and his voice rose above the storm, low and graveled, carrying words not of courtship but of necessity. He spoke of his daughter, a girl hardened by loss, her heart shut against the world since her mother's passing, and of a life he could offer her, a roof over her head, warmth against the cold, protection against the cruelty of the land, a place by his side where survival would be possible. Yet with that offer came a demand, plain and unshakable, carried in the voice of a man who knew time had narrowed to a single moment. Before the priest departed this afternoon, Marty must choose marriage. Today. The wind caught her cloak, tearing it from her shoulder, and for a heartbeat she looked away, the sound of thunder swallowing her thoughts. Around them the storm roared in sympathy with the turmoil in her heart, the priest shifting uneasily, his voice silent but urging her to answer. Marty looked back at Clark then, his face drawn with years of labor and loss, and somewhere between the grief and the rain she felt the strange pull of a decision born not of desire, but of survival. His hand extended, not in promise of love, but as a lifeline offered in the hollow of her despair. The priest glanced toward his saddle, the hour slipping away like water through fingers, and the air seemed to hold its breath. She had no words ready, only the weight of choice pressing down like the storm above. And in that moment, drenched and broken, with winter looming and no home to call her own, the world stood still, waiting for her answer, not to a question of heart, but to the unyielding demand of a man who offered her a home at the cost of her freedom. Marty's hands trembled as she stared down at her husband's grave, the fresh mound of earth dark and glistening in the storm's relentless downpour, her fingers curling into the wet soil as though holding onto something that had already slipped away. Above her, lightning split the sky in brilliant fury, the thunder that followed rolling across the ridge like a herald of reckoning, and in that electric silence that followed she felt voices stirring deep within her, one whispering of betrayal, the other louder, sharper, speaking in the language of survival. The betrayal came first, a cold voice telling her that she had been offered a choice she did not truly want, that she was trading love for duty, that the man kneeling before her was not a savior but a creditor of fate. But the other voice, insistent and raw, spoke of the winter closing in fast, of nights spent shivering under a canvas that would offer no protection, of hunger gnawing at her bones, of wolves circling closer as the cold deepened. To remain meant starvation, loneliness, and exposure to the merciless teeth of the wild. To go with this man meant shelter, food, and the faint promise of warmth, yet at the cost of her freedom and the crossing of some unseen line she could not yet name. Behind her, the priest gathered his things, the clink of his satchel a reminder that time was slipping through her fingers like water in the rain. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, the storm pressing down as though demanding her answer. Around the grave, The wind carried the scent of wet pine and cold earth, and somewhere deep in her chest a hollow ached with the absence of her lost life. Marty glanced toward Clark beside her, his hands still extended, his face unreadable but steady as stone. His daughter's house, his roof, the warmth of a hearth, those were tangible promises in a world that had offered her little else but loss and exposure. Yet the cost of saying yes burned at her throat, the thought of binding herself in such a hasty union feeling like stepping into a cage. The priest shifted his weight, the hourglass of this moment falling fast toward its last grain, and she felt the urgency of winter tighten around her like a noose. Somewhere, thunder roared again, and lightning seared the horizon, a reminder that storms did not wait. She drew her cloak tighter, wet and heavy against her shoulders, her breath coming in ragged bursts, and the truth became undeniable, the choice before her was not one of desire, but of survival. Her heart was torn between grief and necessity, between freedom and shelter, and as the priest turned toward his saddle, she knew the moment would pass forever if she did not speak. Yet even as she opened her lips, the storm's voice thundered louder, as if urging her to decide before the world was swept away. With rain blinding her, each drop a sharp nail against her skin, she drew in a breath that trembled through her chest and whispered the word that sealed her path, yes. It came quietly, almost lost beneath the roar of thunder, yet it carried the weight of her choice, heavy as the earth beneath her boots and the storm above her head. Around her, the wind whipped the air into a blur of water and shadow, as if the heavens themselves bore witness to her surrender, and the priest stood a pace behind them, his face grave, knowing the hour was slipping away. There would be no time for ceremony, no gentle pause to mark the crossing of such a threshold. Before the priest left, beneath the fury of the storm, vows were exchanged not in the soft glow of candlelight, but in the harsh, silver flash of lightning, words falling into the air like sparks in a midnight sky. There was no celebration, no tender kiss to seal the promise, only necessity, two souls bound by circumstance rather than desire, a union forged in grief and urgency. The priest's voice was steady but somber as he spoke the words, and the rancher's grip on her hand was firm, unyielding, as though anchoring them both against the wind. She looked up at him then, searching his eyes for something she could not name, comfort, love, assurance, and found only the resolute truth of survival. Behind her, the grave of her husband lay hidden beneath its sodden shroud, a silent witness to the choice she had made, and somewhere deep within her chest grief still burned, sharp and unrelenting. Yet in the hollow of her sorrow there settled something strange and new, a weight that was not only loss, but responsibility, the burden of a child not her own. Marty thought of the rancher's daughter, Missy, of her cold, guarded eyes and the silence that hung heavier in the house than the storm without, and a knot of duty wound itself tighter around her heart. She did not yet know if she had chosen rightly, nor could she tell whether the road before her was salvation or perdition, but the choice was hers, and hers alone. The priest gave a solemn nod, and the ceremony ended as abruptly as it had begun, his pack slung over his shoulder, the storm still pressing against them with relentless force. The rain poured harder, washing over them like baptism, as she rose beside the rancher, bound to him by vow, necessity, and the fragile hope that shelter might someday become something more. The air was cold and the wind unforgiving, yet beneath it all lay the quiet, unspoken truth. She had chosen a future, not a promise, and that future began here, in the storm. At Clark's homestead, the storm had passed but the air still smelled of wet earth and smoke, the wind carrying a brittle cold that promised winter's arrival. Marty stepped from the wagon, weary and waterlogged, her boots sinking into the frost-darkened soil, and found herself before a rough-hewn house of weathered wood, smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. Clark moved beside her, steady and silent, leading her to the door where it opened with a creak that sounded like old sorrow. Inside, the warmth of a fire met her, but so too did the sharp, unblinking gaze of Missy, a girl no older than 12, her dark hair tangled, her eyes sharp and guarded, as though she had learned too young that trust was a dangerous thing. Her silence was sharper than words, a cold edge that cut deeper than the chill in the air. She watched the woman approach, her stance wary, shoulders squared as if daring the stranger to speak, to prove herself. Nights in the homestead became a test of endurance, the quiet broken only by the crackle of the hearth and the occasional sigh that passed between Marty and Missy, both caught in their own grief. At first, the girl refused to meet her eyes, retreating to shadowed corners or speaking only when spoken to, her voice brittle and clipped, and Marty could sense the invisible wall between them. Yet Marty, bound by vows of necessity and the unspoken duties she had taken, began to show her care in the smallest of ways. A mended dress folded neatly by the hearth, stitched with trembling hands under the dim lamplight, a warm meal left beside her bed, the aroma carrying through the quiet night, a gentle word, soft and unassuming, offered without demand, and often without expectation of reply. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the child's eyes began to change, from suspicion to something else, perhaps curiosity, perhaps a fragile hope. The tension in the house softened, the silence losing some of its sharpness, though the air remained heavy with loss and the weight of unspoken truths. Marty found herself watching Missy with a careful tenderness she had not expected, as though both of them were learning to navigate a world they had been thrust into unwillingly. The child, hardened too soon by sorrow, seemed to measure her every move, yet she could not hide the moments when her gaze lingered, when her eyes betrayed the faintest glimmer of trust. And in those quiet exchanges, between mended cloth and shared bread, between unspoken words and the warmth of a hearth, the woman began to carve herself into a place in the girl's wounded heart, not as a mother yet, but as something equally vital, a presence who would not turn away, no matter how deep the grief ran in that storm-born household, and perhaps, in time, a promise that grief could be softened by the steady work of care. But peace in the frontier was always fragile, like dust on a windswept plain, and it never took long for shadows to return. Rumors had begun to drift into the homestead, carried on the lips of wandering travelers and whispered at distant campfires, that the same outlaws who had murdered Aaron still roamed the hills nearby, their cruelty untouched by time or justice. The air grew taut with unease, the wind carrying more than cold now, carrying rumors that made her heart tighten and her breath come shorter. One night, as the household lay hushed beneath blankets and the wind moaned against the cabin walls, the sharp cracks of gunfire split the air, tearing her from uneasy sleep. Marty's heart thudded in her chest like a drum of warning, and she rushed to the door, rain and darkness mingling beyond the threshold. Clark was gone when she stepped outside, and silence returned like a heavy shroud. Hours later, he came riding through the blackened night, the horses' flanks slick with sweat and their hoofs splashing in mud, his coat torn and stained, his face a mask of exhaustion and fury. Blood clung to his shirt and hands, and in his eyes burned something she had never seen before, a raw, unrelenting fire. He dismounted heavily, his boots thudding into the soaked earth, and without a word carried her to the cabin hearth before speaking at all. When Clark finally did speak, his voice was low, guttural, edged with a vengeance that chilled her more than the storm ever could. The killers were close. That knowledge hung between them like smoke in a still room, heavy and choking, and she felt something shift deep within her. Rage burned in him, a slow, dangerous flame that made his fists clench and his jaw harden, yet fear gripped her, sharper and colder. Survival had bound them in their storm-born union, but now vengeance tempted to tear them apart. She knew the danger, not only of the outlaws, but of letting vengeance take root, of losing what little peace they had found in the walls of the homestead. Behind her, the child's restless breathing and sleep reminded her of what they had to protect, and she realized how delicate their hold on this new life was. Clark stood silent after his words, his shoulders squared as if preparing for a battle yet to come, and she could see the weight of his vow to protect his home, his daughter, and now her, pressing on him. Outside, the night pressed closer, the valley filled with the sound of restless wind and distant echoes, as if the land itself was warning them. Marty stood at the doorway, cloak drawn tight, watching him, wondering if the storm they had both survived was about to return in a darker form, and knowing that whatever came next, it would test them far beyond survival. The rising storm came not only in weather, but in hearts, and the air at the homestead grew heavy with both. Dawn was pale and fractured, the horizon veiled in clouds that promised more than rain. They carried the scent of steel, smoke, and blood. Clark moved through the morning with the quiet precision of a man preparing for war, checking weapons, securing doors, and watching the ridge beyond as though it might erupt at any moment. Marty watched him too, her own heart tangled in fear and something harder, the raw pull of vengeance that now bound them as tightly as the vow she had given. In the child's silence she read her own unease, and she knew the girl felt it too, a tension that pressed down like a weight they could not lift. Rumors of the outlaws' return had sharpened into certainty, their cruelty closer now than ever, and the night's gunshots had burned a trail of resolve through the rancher's bones. Clark spoke little, but each glance toward the ridge, each tightening of his grip on leather and steel, spoke louder than words. Marty moved beside Clark, her own resolve hardening, not for love, but for survival, for the fragile family they had stitched together in the aftermath of storm and grief. The wind rose in the late afternoon, carrying the scent of rain and gunpowder, and Missy stood at the doorway, watching her father and the woman who had become part of their home, eyes wary yet searching. There was no time for tenderness now, there was only the coming reckoning. As twilight fell, the horizon darkened with figures moving in the distance, shapes riding through shadow with the intent of war. Clark mounted silently, Marty close behind, and he cast her a look that held both warning and a promise to protect. She tightened her cloak, the words of their vows from the storm still burning in her mind, and stepped to stand beside him, her own hand finding his. In that touch was a promise too, not of love, but of survival, and of meeting whatever came together. The outlaws came closer, their voices carrying over the valley like a curse, and the air was filled with the heavy rhythm of hooves and heartbeats. Yet even as danger drew near, she made her choice. In the face of peril, she would stay, not as a widow clinging to loss, but as a partner ready to fight for a future. Missy, once cold and silent, stepped forward, her small hand finding hers, and for the first time called her Ma with a voice both fragile and fierce. As dawn rose over the wild land, pale light spilling across the ridges and washing the valley in gold, the widow and the rancher stood side by side, shoulders squared against the storm to come. Their lives were forever changed, not by the proposal at a grave, but by the fragile, stubborn hope that love could be born even in the storm. And with that hope burning between them, they rode forward together, into whatever awaited beyond the rising storm. The days had begun to take on a rhythm, fragile but steady, the widow learning the shape of her new life beneath the roof of a man she had married out of necessity, her grief softening into resolve as she found purpose in small duties and in the hesitant affection of a child who was slowly learning to trust her. But that fragile peace was broken one morning when a haze of dust rose on the horizon, carried on the thunder of hooves, and soon the rancher stood at the doorway with his rifle half raised, his eyes narrowing as a company of riders approached, their badges glinting in the sunlight, their faces carved with determination. At their head rode the sheriff, a man whose reputation carried the weight of law across the territory, his gaze unyielding as it swept across the homestead before settling on her, and though he spoke with the formality of duty, she felt the weight of something personal in his words, for he and his men had been tracking a ruthless band of outlaws who had robbed a bank 2 towns over, leaving behind bodies and smoke, and in their trail of blood was the murder that had shattered her world, the killing of the husband she had buried under storm and sorrow. The sheriff dismounted with the heavy grace of a man who had seen too much violence, the dust of long roads clinging to his coat, and he told her plainly that the killers were near, that the law had followed their trail of chaos to this valley, and that the day of reckoning had finally come. And though her heart surged with a fierce, burning hope, her hands trembled as she realized that justice carried not only promise but danger, for men who could murder in cold blood would not go quietly, and if the fight spilled onto this land it might claim more than vengeance. It might claim her new life as well. She listened as the sheriff described their movements, how they had split into smaller groups, desperate and cornered, their desperation making them twice as deadly, and as he spoke she felt the earth itself shift beneath her, the weight of fate pressing down on her chest, for this was no longer a story of survival but one of judgment, and she, who had once been powerless, was now tied irrevocably to the pursuit of justice, her sorrow intertwining with the law's pursuit until she could no longer tell where her grief ended and vengeance began. The rancher placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, his presence like a wall against the storm of fear inside her, and she drew breath as though for the first time, her eyes fixed on the men who had come to finish what her heart had cried for since the moment she saw her husband's body draped lifeless over a saddle, and in that moment she knew that peace was not yet theirs to claim, for before the land could hold them as family, before love could grow without shadow, justice had to ride through fire and blood to the very end, and she would stand witness, trembling but unflinching, as the law prepared to strike down the men who had stolen everything from her. The valley erupted in violence with the suddenness of a summer storm, the air splitting with the crack of rifles as the sheriff and his men descended on the outlaw camp, their shouts mingling with the shrill whinnies of terrified horses, and in the chaos the widow stood at the rancher's side, her heart pounding so violently it felt as though it would burst through her chest, each gunshot striking her ears like a thunderclap that carried the weight of her grief and her fury. The outlaws, wild-eyed and desperate, scrambled for cover behind rocks and wagons, their pistols spitting fire in blind defiance, but the sheriff's men pressed forward with relentless precision, their bullets finding flesh, their horses rearing and plunging as the dust rose in choking clouds that turned daylight into a haze of grit and smoke, and the widow clutched the edge of the fence, her knuckles white as she watched the men who had destroyed her life finally meet their reckoning, her breath catching with each figure that fell, some writhing in the dust with curses on their lips, others silenced in an instant, their cruelty ending in a spray of red that stained the ground they had once terrorized. The rancher fought alongside the lawman, his rifle steady despite the storm around him, his jaw set with grim determination, and in his stance she saw not only a man defending his land but a man carving justice into the bones of the earth, and though fear twisted in her stomach, a deeper fire rose within her, for each outlaw who dropped was a step toward the closure she had prayed for, a step toward releasing the chains that grief had wrapped around her heart. The battle surged back and forth, bullets snapping past, horses crashing down, men grappling in the dirt with knives and fists when ammunition ran dry, and it seemed for a moment the outlaws' madness might drive them to break through, but the sheriff, unyielding and fierce as iron, led his men with ruthless clarity, flanking and striking until the band began to splinter, their bravado shattering into screams of panic as the circle of law closed tight. When at last the smoke began to clear, the valley lay still, broken only by the moans of the dying and the ragged breath of the captured, their wrists bound with rope, their eyes no longer blazing with cruelty but dulled with the weight of defeat, and among the bodies sprawled in the dust were the faces she could never forget, the murderers of her husband, their last breaths rattling weakly before silence claimed them. Their reign of blood ended not by mercy but by the justice that had hunted them across the plains. She stood trembling, tears streaming down her cheeks, not from sorrow but from the raw release of vengeance fulfilled, and as the sheriff lowered his rifle, his eyes grim with the cost of justice, she felt the earth steady beneath her feet again, as though the valley itself had exhaled, and for the first time since that terrible day she could breathe without choking on despair, for the killers of her husband lay defeated, their cruelty ground into dust by the will of the law and the unyielding march of fate. The battlefield lay quiet in the aftermath, the acrid stench of gunpowder clinging to the air and the dust still settling over the valley like a shroud, and where once the widow had fallen to her knees in despair at the grave of her husband, now she stood tall, her spine straight as a blade, her eyes fixed on the lifeless faces of the men who had stolen her joy, her future, her very breath, and though her heart still carried scars, it now burned with a fire she had not felt since the day her husband first placed his dreams in her hands, a fire no longer kindled by grief but by the fierce triumph of justice at last fulfilled. She stepped slowly among the fallen, each boot print pressing into the dust like an oath, her tears falling freely, but they were not the bitter tears of mourning that had once drenched the earth beside a rain-lashed grave, they were tears of victory, of release, each drop washing away a fragment of the fear that had haunted her nights and hollowed her soul. And when her gaze met the still, vacant eyes of the man whose bullet had ended her husband's life, she did not recoil or tremble but lifted her chin higher, her chest heaving with the raw, ragged cry of a woman who had seen vengeance carried out before her very eyes, her voice breaking into the silence with words that were less spoken than breathed, "It's done." At her side the rancher stood steady, his presence a wall of strength against the memories that threatened to pull her under, his hand reaching for hers with a touch firm yet gentle, binding her to the earth when her emotions threatened to scatter her like the dust around them, and as she looked at him, seeing not just the man who had offered her survival on the day she had been broken but the man who had now fought and bled to help deliver justice, she felt something shift deep within her, not the erasure of sorrow but the birth of freedom, freedom not from the pain of loss but from the fear that had clung to her every step, the dread that had stalked her from dawn to dusk. For the first time since she had whispered goodbye at the coffin, she breathed without heaviness, inhaling deeply of the wild frontier air as if it might finally belong to her again, and in that breath she tasted not just vengeance but hope, fragile and trembling but real. As the sheriff's men gathered the captured and the sun broke through the haze, lighting the valley in a wash of gold, she let herself lean into the rancher's strength, her hand clasping his with certainty, knowing that though sorrow might always haunt the edges of her heart, she had wrestled back her power, and standing tall with fire in her eyes, she was no longer the broken widow left weeping at a grave, she was a woman reborn in the crucible of grief and vengeance, her spirit scarred yet unshaken, her soul blazing with the weight of a freedom she had fought to claim. The valley had grown quiet in the weeks after the gunfire faded, the echoes of vengeance slowly giving way to the rhythms of ordinary life, and though the widow rose each morning with the same determination that had carried her through grief and battle, she began to sense a change within her body, subtle at first, a weariness that clung no matter how much rest she stole, a flutter beneath her heart that made her pause at her chores, her hands instinctively resting on her stomach as though she were guarding something fragile and precious. It was in the silence of the night, lying on a straw mattress in the cabin with the storm winds rattling the shutters, that the truth unfurled in her mind like a lantern flame catching. She was carrying a child, not the rancher's, but Aaron's, the last gift of the man whose blood now fed the earth outside the homestead, and the revelation struck her with the force of both joy and sorrow, a reminder of the life she had lost and a whisper of the life yet to come, and tears filled her eyes, not with the sharp sting of grief but with something softer, something bittersweet, for though her husband was gone, a part of him still lived, growing quietly inside her, a heartbeat not yet heard but already felt, a promise that death had not been able to silence. She feared telling Clark, for though he had been steadfast and kind, she wondered if this truth would widen the gulf between them, a reminder that her heart had once belonged fully to another, and yet when the moment came, when she stood before him in the dim light of morning with trembling hands pressed to the swell that had begun to show, he looked at her not with disappointment or bitterness but with the steady gaze of a man who understood more than words could carry, and he stepped forward, placing his calloused hand gently over hers, feeling the small rise beneath her dress, his eyes softening as he whispered that no matter whose blood ran in this child, he would claim the boy as his own, raise him with the same strength and care he gave his daughter, for family was not forged only by blood but by choice, by sacrifice, by love. Her breath caught at his vow, her heart breaking open in a new way, for in that moment she saw the measure of the man she had married in desperation, the man who had become her anchor through storm and grief, and gratitude flooded her so deeply it threatened to undo her, and though she still wept for Aaron, for the life stolen from them too soon, she also wept for the mercy of having found a place where this child would be welcomed, not as a burden or a ghost of the past but as a son of the household, cherished and protected, and as Clark's hand lingered on her belly, she felt a warmth spread through her, a fragile peace blooming like a wildflower in barren soil, fragile yet undeniable, for the secret she carried was no longer a weight she bore alone, it was a promise shared, a bridge between past and future, sorrow and hope. And in the quiet of that moment she knew that even in the unforgiving wild, life had a way of rising from the ashes, demanding to be lived, demanding to be loved. The storm came without mercy, rolling down from the mountains with a roar that shook the shutters and swallowed the valley in white, the wind screaming against the cabin walls as if the wilderness itself sought to test their strength, and within that frail shelter the widow clutched her swollen belly, her face pale and drawn, every contraction tearing through her with the force of a wave against rock. While Clark moved anxiously around her, his jaw set, his hands shaking though he tried to steady them, knowing no midwife could ever reach them through the howling snow, the drifts already swallowing fences and half the barn, leaving them alone in this trial, man, woman, and child yet unborn. The fire in the hearth crackled weakly, shadows dancing across the wooden walls as Clark dropped to his knees beside her, whispering encouragements he hardly believed. His mind reaching desperately for the only knowledge he possessed, the long nights spent in the barn with calving cattle, the rhythms of nature he had learned with rope and lantern, and though the comparison tore at him with guilt, it was all he had to guide him, and he prayed silently, fiercely, that God might steady his hands and grant them both the strength to endure. The hours stretched endlessly, time marked only by the rise and fall of her cries, each one a dagger to his heart, her pain a weight he would have given anything to bear himself. And yet she clung to his hand, her nails digging into his skin as if anchoring herself to the world, and he whispered over and over that she was not alone, that he would not leave her, not for a breath, not for a heartbeat. Until at last the moment came, the final push wrung from her body with a scream that rivaled the storm outside, and into Clark's trembling hand slipped the fragile, squirming form of a baby boy, slick with blood and birth, his tiny chest heaving once, then again, before a piercing cry split the cabin air. High and sharp as a hymn of hope sung into the teeth of the blizzard, and Clark, his eyes wide with awe, lifted the child gently, his rough fingers trembling as if afraid the boy might shatter beneath their touch, joy breaking through the hardened lines of his weather-worn face as tears filled his eyes unbidden, for though the child bore another man's blood, in that instant he claimed him fully, utterly, as his son. The widow, exhausted but radiant, reached for the boy, her tears mixing with laughter as she cradled him to her chest. And Clark leaned close, his hand covering them both, his voice breaking as he swore that no storm, no sorrow, no shadow of the past would ever keep this family from standing together. And though the wind still howled and snow pressed heavy against the roof, the cabin glowed with a warmth no storm could touch, a warmth born of love chosen, not inherited, forged not in ease but in fire and trial, and in that fragile cocoon of flickering firelight and newborn cries, they found what they had sought all along in the wild frontier.